Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Welcome to the Revolutionary Reading Theater, comrades. For us today, we are continuing on with a read of Michael Parenti's Blackshirts and Reds. We are on chapter 6, The Free Market Goes East. See, the trick is those intros allow me to get the next part ready while they're playing. That's the little behind the secret sausage making factoid for you right there. All right, let's go. Chapter 6. The Free Market Paradise Goes East. Part 1. Capitalist restoration in the former communist countries has taken different forms. In Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, it involved the overthrow of communist governments. Okay, here's another one of the big Parenti blunders right here. In China, it proceeded within the framework of a communist system. It seems to be happening in Vietnam, and perhaps will eventually happen in North Korea and Cuba. God damn it, Parenti. We strongly disagree. He did change his position on this later, but I had to read it as it is. While the Chinese government continues under anomaly communist leadership, the process of private capital penetration goes on more or less unhindered. Anyway, let's get to the real information now. Suppression of the left. The anti-communists who took power in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in 1989-91 set about to impose bourgeois dominance over political and cultural life. Purging communists from government, the media, universities, professions, and courts, while presenting themselves as democratic reformers. They soon grew impatient with the way democratic reforms of popular resistance limited their efforts to install an unrestrained free market capitalism. In Russia, associates of President Boris Yeltsin talked of the dangers of democracy, quote unquote, and complained that, quote, the most representative bodies have become a hindrance to our market reforms. Nation 12-2-91 and 5-4-92. Apparently, the free market, said by reformers to be the very foundation of political democracy, could not be introduced through democratic means. In 1992, the presidents of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Russia demanded that their parliaments be suspended and that they be allowed to rule by presidential decree, with repressive measures against quote-unquote hardliners and holdovers who resisted the free market reforms. Their goal was not power to the people, but profits to the privileged. This process of democratization via suppression began even before the actual overthrow of communism. In 1991, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, prodded by Russian President Yeltsin, announced that the Communist Party of the USSR no longer had legal status. Fuck you, Gorbachev. The party's membership funds and buildings were confiscated. Workers were prohibited from engaging in any kind of political activities in the workplace. 6 leftist newspapers were suppressed, while all other publications, many of them openly reactionary, enjoyed uninterrupted distribution. The US media, and even many on the US left, hailed these acts of suppression as moving ahead with democratic reforms, quote unquote. Gorbachev then demanded that the Soviet Congress abolish itself. It had remained too resistant to change. Actually, the Congress was not opposed to democratic debate and multi-party elections. These were already in practice. It resisted an unbridled free market capitalism, and for that reason would have to go. Gorbachev repeatedly cut off the microphones during debate and threatened single-handedly to abolish the Congress by emergency decree. He forced a vote 3 times until he got his desired abolition. These strong-arm methods were reported in the US press without critical comment. What gave Yeltsin and Gorbachev the excuse to pursue this repressive course was the curious incident of August 1991, when a nervous group of leaders, mouthing vague phrases about the deterioration of life in Soviet Union, attempted an oddly orchestrated coup, quote-unquote, against the Gorbachev government, one that flopped before it ever got off the ground. Weeks later, Washington Post, 9/26/91, noted happily that the defeat of the coup was a triumph for the Soviet-moneyed class. Among the coup's militant opponents were private entrepreneurs and thousands of members of Russian stock exchange, who routinely made 20 times the average wage of the ordinary Soviets. They headed onto, quote, the streets of Moscow to defend their right to wheel and deal. The coup collapsed, democracy triumphed. Private businessmen contributed more than 15 million rubles to buy food and equipment for the defenders, unquote. One broker was struck by how few workers responded to Yeltsin's call to defend democracy. The boldness of this investor class in the face of an armed coup may have another explanation. A socialist critic of communism, Boris Kargalitsky, argued, quote, in fact there was no coup at all. The soldiers were unarmed and confused. The tanks called out were undirected, quote, and the leaders were the so-called coup never even seriously tried to take power. The real coup, says Karlitsky, came in the aftermath when Boris Yeltsin used the incident to exceed his constitutional powers and dismantle the Soviet Union itself, absorbing all its powers into his own Russian Republic, while claiming to be undoing the old regime. Yeltsin overthrew the new democratic Soviet government of 1989-1991. In late 1993, facing strong popular resistance to his harsh free market policies, Yeltsin went further. He forcibly disbanded the Russian parliament and every other elected representative body in the country, including municipal and regional councils. He abolished Russia's constitutional court and launched an armed attack upon the parliamentary building, killing an estimated 2,000 resistors and demonstrators. Thousands more were jailed without charges or a trial, and hundreds of elected officials were placed under investigation. Yeltsin banned labor unions from all political activities, suppressed dozens of publications, exercised monopoly control over all broadcast media, and permanently outlawed 15 political parties. He unilaterally scrapped the Constitution and presented the public with a new one that gave the president nearly absolute power over policy while reducing the democratically elected parliament virtually impotence. For these crimes, he was hailed as a defender of democracy by US leaders and media. What they most liked about Yeltsin was that he, quote, never wavered in his support for privatization. San Francisco Chronicle, 7/6/1994. Yeltsin, the Democrat, twice suspended publication of the Communist Party newspaper Pravda. He charged it exorbitant rent for the use of its own facilities. Then, in March 1992, he confiscated the paper's 12-story building and its press and turned full ownership over to Russkaya Gazeta, a government pro-Yeltsin newspaper. Yeltsin's elite, Oman troops repeatedly attacked leftist demonstrators and pickets in Moscow and other Russian cities. Parliamentary deputy Andrei Zdrzdis, an independent, and deputy Valentin Martynov, a communist, who both vigorously opposed the Yeltsin government, were victims of political assassination. In 1994, journalist Dmitry Kolodov, who was probing corruption in high places, was also assassinated. Okay, how do you say? Welcome in, comrade. Everybody follow our comrade K, please. In 1996, Yeltsin won re-election as president, beating out a serious challenge from a communist rival. His campaign was assisted by teams of US electoral advisors. Remember this when we study election interference in Canada and the US by Russian and Chinese agents. Teams of US electoral advisors who use sophisticated polling techniques and focus groups. Yeltsin also benefited from multi-million-dollar donations from US sources and a $10 billion aid package from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Equally important for victory was the crooked counting of ballots, as cursorily reported in one ABC late evening news story in July 1996. Yeltsin exercised monopoly control over Russia's television networks, enjoyed campaign coverage that amounted to non-stop promotionals. In contrast, opposition candidates were reduced to non-persons, given only fleeting exposure, if that. Yeltsin's re-election was hailed in the West as a victory for democracy. In fact, it was a victory for private capital and monopoly media, which is not synonymous with democracy, though often treated as such by US leaders and opinion makers. Yeltsin's commitment is to capitalism, not democracy. In March 1996, several months before the election, when polls showed him trailing the communist candidate Gennady Zyuganov, Yeltsin ordered decrees drawn up, quote, that would have canceled the election, closed down parliament, and banned the Communist Party. New York Times, 7/2/1996. But he was dissuaded by advisors who feared the measures might incite too much resistance. Though he decided not to call off the election, Yeltsin was never committed to turning over the government to a communist if he lost. It's reported by the San Francisco Chronicle, 7/26/1996. During the 1996 campaign, Yeltsin and his associates repeatedly announced that a communist victory would bring civil war. In effect, they were voicing their willingness to discard democracy and resort to force and violence if the election did not go their way. Nor was it taken as an idle threat. At one point, surveys showed that about half the population believed that civil war would result if the communists won. Sacramento Bee, 7/9/1996. Through all of this, Yeltsin received vigorous support. Of course he did. From the White House and the US media. An editorial in The Nation, 6/17/96, asked, what if a popularly elected communist president in Russia had pursued Yeltsin's harsh policies of privatization, plunging his country into poverty, turning over most of its richest assets to a small segment of previous communist officials, suppressing dissident elements, using tanks to disband a popularly elected parliament that opposed his policies, rewriting the constitution to give himself almost dictatorial powers, and doing all the other things Yeltsin has done. Would US leaders enthusiastically devote themselves to the re-election of this communist president and remain all but silent about his transgressions? The question is posed rhetorically. The Nation editorial presumes the answer is no. In fact, I would respond, yes, of course. US leaders would have no trouble supporting this quote-unquote communist president, for he would be communist in name only. In actual deed, he would be devoted agent of capitalist restoration. One need only look at how successive administrations in Washington have cultivated friendly relations with the present communist leaders in China, oh dear, overlooking and even explaining away their transgressions. As China's leaders open their country to private investment and growing economic inequality, warning, they offer up a dispossessed labor force ready to work double-digit hours for subsistence pay at enormous profit for the multinationals, US political economic leaders know what they are doing, even if some editorial writers in this country do not. Their eye is on the money, not the color of the vessel it comes in. Since the overthrow of communism, free market, right-wing forces in the various Eastern European countries enjoyed significant financial and organizational assistance from US financed agencies, such as the National Endowment for Democracy, the CFL-CIO's Free Trade Union Institute, a group intimately linked to the CIA, and the Free Congress Foundation, an organization with an anti-communist and conservative religious ideology. Communists and other Marxists endured political repression throughout Eastern Europe. In East Germany, the Party of Democratic Socialism had its property and offices paid for by party members, seized in an attempt to bankrupt it. In Latvia, the communist activist Alfreds Rubiks, who protested the inequalities of free market reform, has been kept in prison for years without the benefit of a trial. In Lithuania, communist leaders were tortured and then imprisoned for long durations. Georgia's anti-communist president, Zviad Gamashurdia, incarcerated opponents from some 70 political groups without granting them a trial. San Francisco Chronicle, 4/17/1991. Estonia held free elections, quote unquote, in which 42% of the population was prohibited from voting because of their Russian, Ukrainian, or Belarusian antecedents. Russians and other minorities were excluded from many jobs and faced discrimination in housing and schools. Latvia also disenfranchised Russians and other non Latvian nationals, many of whom had lived in the country for almost half a century. So much for the flowering of democracy. One-way democracy. More important than democratic rule was free market reform, a code word for capitalist restoration. As long as democracy could be used to destabilize one-party communist rule, it was championed by the forces of reaction. But when democracy worked against free market restoration, the outcome was less tolerated. In 1990, in Bulgaria, capitalist restoration did not go according to plan, despite generous financial and organizational assistance from US sources, including the Free Congress Foundation. The Bulgarian conservatives ended up a poor second to the communists, in what Western European observers judged to be fair and open election. What followed was a coordinated series of strikes, demonstrations, economic pressure, acts of sabotage, and other disruptions reminiscent of CIA orchestrated campaigns against left governments in Chile, Jamaica, Nicaragua, British Guiana. Within 5 months, the free market oppositionists forced the democratically elected communist government to resign. Bulgarian communists complained that the US had violated democratic principles in working against freely elected officials. The same pattern emerged in Albania, where the democratically elected communist government won an overwhelming victory at the polls, only to face demonstrations, a general strike, economic pressure from abroad, and campaigns of disruption financed by the National Endowment for Democracy and the other US sources. After 2 months, the communist government collapsed. Once the right took power, a new law was passed denying Albanian communists and other opponents of capitalist restoration the right to vote or otherwise participate in political activities. As a reward for having extended democratic rights to all citizens, the Albanian communists and all former state employees and judges were stripped of their civil rights. In 1996 Albanian elections, the socialists and other opposition parties, who had been predicted to do well, withdrew from the election hours before the polls closed, in protest of the blatantly rigged vote. Election monitors from the European Union and the United States said they witnessed numerous instances of police intimidation and the stuffing of ballot boxes. The Socialist Party had its final campaign rally banned and a number of prominent leaders barred from running for office because of their past communist affiliations. New York Times, 5/28/1996. When the Socialists and other allies tried to hold protest rallies, they were attacked by Albanian security forces, who beat and severely injured dozens of demonstrators, as reported by People's Weekly World in 5/11/96 and 6/1/1996. Openly anti-Semitic groups, crypto-fascist parties, and hate campaigns surfaced in Russia, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, Belarus, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Museums that commemorated heroic anti-fascist resistance were closed down, and monuments to the struggle against Nazism were dismantled. In countries like Lithuania, former Nazi war criminals were inexonerated. Some even compensated for the years they had spent in jail. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated, and xenophobic attacks against foreigners of darker hue increased. With the communists no longer around, Jews and foreigners were blamed for low crop prices, inflation, crime, and other social ills. On June 11, 1995, Lech Walesa, personal pastor, Father Henryk Jankowski, declared during a mass in Warsaw that, quote, the Star of David is implicated in the swastika as well as in the hammer and sickle, unquote, and that the, quote, diabolical aggressiveness of the Jews was responsible for the emergence of communism, unquote, and for World War II. Jesus fuck. This, and by the way, I'm sure he'll point it out later, but if you don't know, Lech Walesa here was praised by so many of her friends on the US left as being bringing in democracy and all, like, just praised by the likes of people like Noam Chomsky and stuff. The priest added that Poles should not tolerate governments made up of people who are tied to Jewish money. Walesa, who was present during the sermon, declared that his friend Jankowski was not an anti-Semite, but simply misinterpreted. Rather than retracting his comments, Jankowski spewed forth the same bile in a subsequent television interview. At about that time, placards that read, quote, Jews to the gas and down with the Jewish communist conspiracy were visible at a Polish solidarity demonstration of 10,000 in Warsaw, earning not a censorious word from church or state authorities. Nation 8/7/95. Yeah. Oh yeah, Red Rust, absolutely. Welcome in, by the way. Soda, leave the cords alone. Get out of here. Don't you start up. Sorry about that, cat. The economic policies of the fascist Pinochet regime in Chile were openly admired by the newly installed capitalist government in Hungary. In 1991, leading political figures and economists from the soon-to-be abolished USSR attended a seminar on Chilean economics in Santiago and enjoyed a cordial meeting with mass murderer General Pinochet. The Chilean dictator also was accorded a friendly interview in Literanya Gazeta, a major Russian publication. Yeltsin's former security chief, Alexandra Lebed, is a Pinochet admirer. Instead of being transformed into capitalist states, some communist nations were entirely obliterated as political entities. Besides the obvious example of the Soviet Union, there is the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, which was absorbed into the Federal Republic of Germany. South Yemen was militarily attacked and crushed by North Yemen. Ethiopia was occupied by Tigray and Eritrean forces that imprisoned large numbers of Ethiopians without trial, expropriated Ethiopian property, suppressed Ethiopian education, business, and news media, and imposed a systematic enforcement of tribalism and news media, and imposed a systematic enforcement of tribalism in political organization and education, as reported by the Tilahan Yilma Correspondence, New York Times, 4/24/1996. A systematic enforcement of tribalist political organization might well describe Yugoslavia's fate, a nation that was fragmented by force of arms into a number of small conservative republics under the suzerainty of Western powers. With that dismemberment came a series of wars, repressions, and atrocities committed by all contending sides. One of Yugoslavia's first breakaway republics was Croatia in 1990. It was taken over by a rightist cadre, including some former Nazi collaborators. Backed by the armed might of proto-fascist National Guard Corps under the constitution that relegated Serbs, Jews, Roma, and Muslims to second-class status, Serbs were driven from civil service and police, evicted from their homes, had their businesses taken from them, and were subjected to special property taxes. Serbian newspapers in Croatia were suppressed. Yeah, I was reading along, I caught it. Many Serbs were forced from the land they had inhabited for 3 centuries. Still, Croatia was hailed by its Western backers as a newborn democracy. In 1996, Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko, a self-professed admirer of Adolf Hitler's organizational skills, shut down the independent newspapers and radio stations and decreed the opposition parliament defunct. Lukashenko was awarded absolute power in referendum that claimed an inflated turnout, with no one knowing how many ballots were printed or how they were counted. Some opposition leaders fled for their lives. Quote, once a rich Soviet republic that produced tractors and TVs, Belarus is now a basket case, unquote, with a third of the population living in deep poverty. San Francisco Bay Guardian, 12/4/1996. Oh, I know, Lukashenko is still going. Oh God. Here comes Václav Havel. Strap in for this part. We're looking at Czechoslovakia here now. Must we adore Václav Havel? No figure among the capitalist restorationists in the East has won more adulation from US officials, media pundits, and academics than Václav Havel, a playwright who became the first president of post-communist Czechoslovakia and later president of the Czech Republic. The many left-leaning people who also admire Havel seem to have overlooked some things about him. His reactionary religious obscurantism, his undemocratic suppression of leftist opponents, and his profound dedication to economic inequality and unrestrained free market capitalism. Raised by governesses and chauffeurs in a wealthy and fervently anti-communist family, Havel denounced democracy's, quote, cult of objectivity and statistical average, and the idea that rational, collective, social efforts should be applied to solving the environmental crisis. He called for a new breed of political thinker who would rely less on rational cognitive thinking, show humility in the face of mysterious order of being, and, quote, trust in his own subjectivity as his principal link with the subjectivity of the world. God damn. Apparently, this new breed of leader would be a superior elitist cognator, not unlike Plato's philosopher kings, endowed with a, quote, sense of transcendental responsibility and archetypal wisdom, unquote. Havel never explained how this transcendent archetypal wisdom would translate into actual policy decisions and for whose benefit, at whose expense. Havel called for efforts to preserve the Christian family in the Christian nation, presenting himself as a man of peace and stating that he would never sell arms to oppressive regimes. He sold weapons to the Philippines and the fascist regime in Thailand. In June 1994, General Pinochet, the man who butchered Chilean democracy, was reported to be arms shopping in Czechoslovakia with no audible objections from Havel. Yeah, in that context, Lukashenko, yeah, in the context of what came of the leadership of what came before Lukashenko, not so good. Havel joined wholeheartedly in George Bush's Gulf War, an enterprise that killed over 100,000 Iraqi civilians. In 1991, along with other Eastern European pro-capitalist leaders, Havel voted with the United States to condemn human rights violations in Cuba. But he never uttered a word of condemnation of rights violations in El Salvador, Colombia, Indonesia, or any other U.S. client state. In 1992, while president of Czechoslovakia, Havel, the great Democrat, demanded the parliament be suspended and he be allowed to rule by edict, the better to ram through free market reforms. That same year, he signed a law that made the advocacy of communism a felony with a penalty of up to 8 years imprisonment. He claimed the Czech constitution required him to sign it. In fact, as he knew, the law violated the Charter of Human Rights, which is incorporated into Czech constitution. In any case, it did not require his signature to become law. In 1995, he supported and signed another undemocratic law barring communists and former communists from employment in public agencies. Hell yeah, Red Rust. I'm glad you comrades are enjoying these reads. I feel like I'm getting better at reading them less robotically and putting some emotion as I read, so yeah, hopefully you all enjoy the reads. And like I say, I do cut these all out. You can find them on my Twitch under the playlist called Live Reads, also on my YouTube under the same playlist name. I appreciate y'all being here for the reading, really do. 54 people here listening to Blackshirts and Reds. Fucking love you, comrades. The propagation of anti-communism has remained a top priority for Havel. He led a Frame International campaign. San Francisco Chronicle, 2/1795. To keep in operation 2 U.S. financed Cold War radio stations, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, so they could continue saturating Eastern Europe with their anti-communist propaganda. Under Havel's government, a law was passed making it a crime to propagate national, religious, and class hatred. In effect, criticisms of big moneyed interests were now illegal, being unjustifiably lumped with ethnic and religious bigotry. Havel's government warned labor unions not to involve themselves in politics. Some militant unions had their property taken from them and handed over to compliant company unions. In 1995, Havel announced that the revolution against communism would not be complete until everything was privatized. Havel's government liquidated the properties of the Soviet Union of Youth. Of the Socialist Union of Youth, which included campsites, recreation halls, and cultural and scientific facilities for children, putting the properties under the management of 5 joint stock companies, at the expense of the youth who were left to roam the streets. Well, if the revolution that feeds the children gets my support, this quote-unquote revolution would get my undiluted animosity. Under Czech privatization and restitution programs, factories, shops, estates, homes, and much of the public land was sold at bargain prices to foreign and domestic capitalists. In the Czech and Slovak republics, former aristocrats or their heirs were being given back all the lands their families had held before 1918 under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, dispossessing the previous occupants and sending many of them into destitution. Havel himself took personal ownership of public properties that had belonged to his family 40 years before, while presenting himself as a man dedicating to doing good for others. He did well for himself. For these reasons, some of us do not have warm, fuzzy feelings towards Vaclav Havel. In a country that cared about its workers, said one machinist. Wait, 102. Hold on, this happens sometimes. 98. Okay, I just gotta go. Oh my goodness. Okay, sadly. The fuck? 98, and then it goes. Hold on, let me just see something here. Look, as it goes from 99 to 102. Okay, one sec. Let's just check something real quick, just before I just go on. Oh, wait, that's the wrong one. I need the other one. Let me just see if this version might not have that problem. I thought it was in here. Maybe it's under required. Hey, Mama. Welcome, welcome. Found it. Let me see if this has the same problem here. Free Market Paradise goes east, and I was on 99. Yep. It looks like it is. God dang it. Okay, well, we're missing just a couple pages, sadly, where he's talking about what happens in Greece. Aw, that's sad. Okay, well, you'll just have to imagine things are bad in Greece, and in a country that cared about its workers, said one machinist who was now sorry he had opposed the socialist system that was there. New York Times, 5/8/94. In Macedonia, one of the breakaway republics of Yugoslavia, you got do you got one that's got the missing pages, GMO? If you got one that's got the missing pages, link it right quick. I'm only missing fucking 3 pages here. In Macedonia, one of the breakaway republics of Yugoslavia, a labor representative noted, quote, privatization seems to mean the destruction of our companies. Macedonians seemed more troubled by free market economic hardships than by the much publicized ethnic rivalries. Oh, perfect. Oh. I have to request access. Whatever. We're not missing too much shits, but we're not missing too much here. That's okay. In Macedonia, one of the breakaway republics of Yugoslavia, labor representative. The rest of this will make up for it, don't worry. The labor representative noted, privatization seems to mean the destruction of our companies. Macedonians seemed more troubled by free market economic hardships than by the much publicized ethnic rivalries. They complained about how work has taken over their lives. Quote, one has no time to care about others. There's no time even for oneself. only time for making money. PBS TV Report 1/16/95. Agricultural output of grain, corn, livestock. Damn, yeah, I still can't get it to open here. There. See. Yeah, it's being a jerk. Agricultural output of grain, corn, livestock, and other products plummeted in the former communist countries, as thousands of cooperative farms were forcibly broken up. The new private farmers have small plots, often cannot get loans, seeds, fertilizer, or machinery, and are rapidly losing their holdings or reverting to subsistence farming. Hungary's agricultural cooperatives had been one sector of the socialist economy that performed well, but with privatization, farm output tumbled 40% in 1993. Los Angeles Times, 1/29/94. A drastic deterioration in agricultural production occurred in Bulgaria, once considered the breadbasket of Eastern Europe, causing severe bread shortages by 1996. Bulgaria was also suffering from a 20% monthly inflation and was sinking into that familiar cycle of foreign debt, cutting back on services to qualify for IMF loans, borrowing to pay off past borrowing. Quote, the Bulgarian government must impose more free market austerity measures to get vital international loans to repay portions of the 9.4 billion foreign debt. San Francisco Chronicle, 7/18/96. In 1992, the Lithuanian government decreed that former owners and their descendants could reclaim property confiscated during the socialist era. As a result, tens of thousands of farming families, about 70% of the rural population, were evicted from land they had worked for over half a century, destroying the country's agricultural base in the process. Much production in East Germany was dismantled to prevent competition with West German firms. This was especially evident when collective agriculture was broken up to protect the heavily subsidized and less productive private farms of West Germany. Without making compensation, West German capitalists grabbed almost all the socialized property in the GDR, including factories, mills, farms, apartments, and other real estate, and the medical care system, assets worth about $2 trillion, in what has amounted to the largest expropriation of public wealth by private capital in European history. Okay, GMO, thank you. The end result of all of this free market privatization in East Germany is that rents, once 5% of one's income, have climbed to as much as 2/3. Likewise, the cost of transportation, childcare, healthcare, and higher education have soared beyond the reach of many. The East Germans of various political stripes have a number of complaints. A. The net money flow has been east to west in what amounts to a colonization of the East. B. The free market is a myth. The West German economy is heavily subsidized and fully regulated, but against the interests of the East. And C. West German police are much more brutal than were the East German police. Fancy that. D. If West Germany had denazified anywhere near as thoroughly as it forced the East to desocialize, it would be a totally different country. It's reported by Z Magazine, 7/1992. On that last point, it should be noted that German officials were bringing criminal charges against those who collaborated with the GDR of East Germany in any official capacity, including even teachers and minor administrators. Emigres from communist states were astonished by the amount of bureaucracy they find in the West. 2 Soviet immigrants to Canada complained, independently of each other, that bureaucracy here was even worse than at home. Monthly Review, 5/1988. East Germans living in the West were staggered by the flood of complicated forms they had to fill out for taxes, health insurance, life insurance, unemployment compensation, job retraining, rent subsidies, and bank accounts. Furthermore, quote, because of the kind of personal information they had to give, they felt more observed and spied on than they were by the Stasi, the GDR security police. Z Magazine, 7/1992. Soviet Jewish people who emigrated to Israel during the Cold War era experienced similar disillusionment with the difficulties of life and lack of idealism. The discouraging letters they sent home were considered an important factor in the drop in immigration from USSR to Israel. Thank fuck. With the capitalist restoration in full swing, the peoples for the former communist nations had ample opportunity to learn what life was like in the free market paradise. Their experiences are detailed in the next chapter, which we will read next week.